Knight and Changeling, Chapter 27, Stitches. Gwen really wished this had happened at a better time. Well, more honestly, she wished it hadn't happened at all. Kevin had taken a day off. It was his mother's birthday, the first one they got to spend together since he was a kid. She couldn't call him in on this, but looking over at her cousin in the passenger seat of her own car, her left arm, the one without the Ultimatrix, wrapped in medical gauze, it made her nauseous. She was currently wearing a spare tank top Gwen had found in the trunk, and currently slept soundly, thanks to a spell Gwen had managed. They'd been tracking Jennifer Nocturne and Captain Nemesis, the latter of whom had broken out of prison and by all appearances kidnapped the movie star. They'd tracked them down to a seedy motel, but the room had appeared empty. Gwen had gone to check with the night manager to make sure they hadn't checked out. It was only when she'd heard a car engine gunning that she turned to check and make sure Jen hadn't found something. She'd spotted Nemesis in the driver's seat of a car racing out of the parking lot. She'd run to the room, which had been locked. Blasting down the door, she found her cousin on the floor, her shoulder a bloody wreck. She'd panicked. She would admit that. It had been a long time since she'd seen Jen covered in that much of her own blood. So she'd taken her to the nearest hospital. That had been a mistake. She should have teleported them to the nearest plumber base. The hospital wasn't well equipped to handle Jen. Gwen had never really quite comprehended how much the Omnitrix had changed her cousin on a physical level. Painkillers did nothing to touch the agony she seemed to be in as the doctors tried to wrestle her to a gurney. She'd torn her stitches twice as they were putting them in before Gwen's panicked mind caught up to her and she knocked her cousin out with a spell. She should be waking up soon. As if on cue, a groan sounded from the prone figure strapped into the passenger seat. Did they get away? Gwen was surprised at how clear the question came out. She made to put a hand on Jen's shoulder, but paused, thinking better of it. You were bleeding out on the floor when I got back to the room. They got away. But we're tracking them now. Jen frowned, hissing as she sat up. Don't move around too much. You've got 16 stitches in your arm. At least 2 torn tendons. Jen blinked at her. That explains some things. Why does it still hurt so much? Gwen glanced at Jen. Did she not know that regular medications didn't work on her? I went to the nearest hospital. Jen nodded slightly. Ah, that explains it. They don't have painkillers that work on me. Gwen shook her head. No, they don't. Can you let me know stuff like that next time? Jen nodded. Thought you already knew. Where are we going? Gwen shook her head. If I had my way, home. Jen turned to glare at her, hissing in pain as she did so. Gwen continued. But you're stubborn enough to go after them alone, even this hurt. So we're heading to a Dr. Purvis. I called Cooper and had him hack into Jennifer's accounts. If Nesmith is using her, he's using her money. She just wired a very large chunk of money to him. Jen shook her head. Except he's not using her. Well, he might be, but she's the one who put a hole in my arm. I had Nesmith on the ropes. I wasn't expecting her to attack. Gwen shook her head. Fuck. Jen nodded. Kevin Levin hated missing the action. He always had. He'd admit that the weekly apocalyptic disasters were wearing on him a bit, but the rush of adrenaline he got from the fight was definitely his drug of choice. Though having a nice day at the beach with his mom, where no one tried to kill him, was great. So that evening, after she had gone to bed, he headed out to meet up with Gwen and Jen and go over what had happened while he was off duty. But they weren't at Mr. Smoothie's like they'd planned. He frowned and called Gwen. We're in the med bay. You should probably get over here. We're going to be here a while. Kevin frowned, putting his foot down. He reached Ed's, the closest entrance to the base, and raced through it, barely nodding at the other plumber agents as he went. Gwen was sitting in the waiting room. What happened? Are you okay? Gwen nodded. I'm fine. Jen's in surgery. Kevin let out a low breath. What happened? Surprisingly, Jennifer Nocturne with a textbook case of Stockholm Syndrome. And Captain Nemesis's gauntlet. Kevin hissed. That suit could do some serious damage. Gwen kept talking. And of course, because my cousin doesn't know how to do things the easy way, she kept fighting. Tore her stitches. We got them, though. Nemesis is claiming he kidnapped her, but she's being sent to the psych ward, and he's back behind bars. Kevin let out a low groan of sympathy, sinking onto one of the chairs next to Gwen.
Your cousin is a bit of a mess.
As much as I hate to admit it, you're right, Kevin. A voice came from the doorway. The teens looked up at Max Tennyson standing there holding a data pad.
But since I got you both here, I have a few files I'd like you to look over.
He handed Gwen the data pad and sat down with them.
Just a few possible candidates for her new partner. Some are more experienced than others, but honestly, I'm looking to put her with someone who can learn from her as much as she learns from them.
Kevin nodded.
Yeah, these have to go then. Magisters. They won't do much control. And they won't be up for some of the more questionable choices she has to make. Too much red tape, not flexible enough.
Kevin said, flicking his finger over the screen, scrolling through the files. Gwen nodded. I agree, she said, skimming through a few files. These two are out, too. Head of her fan club at the academy and vice president of the same fan club. They'll bend too easily. Kevin paused.
Yeah, this one's promising. Florana got a few years under their belt. Combat experience.
Gwen nodded at him, skimming the file over her shoulder. Put that one in the maybe pile. She spends a lot of time in places that it wouldn't be difficult for a Florana to survive. The Arctic's been a favorite hideout of Animos recently. Kevin nodded.
Yeah, fair point. Never met one of these guys before. Good in combat and practice. A few missions under his belt. Flexible. Toss him in the maybe pile, too.
He said, skimming the file. Gwen nodded, and they kept at it. For a while, vetoing candidates left and right. There were a lot of beings to go through. Gwen turned to Max. How many people signed up for this? Max shook his head.
Yeah, technically no one signed up. I put out the word to a few magisters that I trust that she'd be in need of a new partner soon. They put forward a few candidates. A lot more than I was expecting. Actually.
Gwen nodded at her grandfather. I'm betting word got around. Max laughed.
I have no doubt. I'm just hoping word hasn't gotten to her yet. I want to keep this a bit of a surprise.
Gwen frowned. She's more likely to fight you on it. Max shrugged.
She's gonna fight me on it either way. She won't want new blood. She'll want someone she knows how to work with. But Helen won't work without Manny, and she and Manny don't get along. Alan is being scouted for a team already. Pierce won't be back in the field for a while. He's still regrowing most of an organ. Cooper is a non-combatant. I ran short of options.
Max said, shaking his head.
Besides, I think new blood will do her some good.
The doctor stepped into the room and Kevin handed the data pad to Max. The doctor, an Apollinite, smiled. She's going to be fine. She tore several tendons and nicked a muscle, but we managed to heal her up nicely. There's a small scar and we'll be keeping her overnight for observation. But overall, she'll be fine. Gwen frowned, standing up. She wasn't able to heal herself, but you were able to heal her. He nodded.
Part of the problem was she'd lost a lot of blood and didn't give herself any time to rest. Even with the powers of an Apollinite, there are limits, especially to healing oneself.
Gwen nodded, and the three of them headed into the room where Jen lay asleep on the bed. Chapter 28, A Moment's Peace. Dealing with Animo and his dinosaur men eggs was pretty simple, and by the end of the day, they were at Mr. Smoothie's enjoying a victory drink. Jen frowned around, and Kevin bumped her with his shoulder.
What's wrong?
Jen shook her head. I'm gonna miss this. Gwen glanced at Kevin. Gwen's going off to college in August. Gwen blinked. She hadn't told Jen that she'd been accepted yet. Auntie Natalie told me. She's planning a party, but you didn't hear it from me. You're heading off to Friedkin? Gwen nodded. Yeah, I am. Jen nodded and turned to Kevin. I'm guessing you're going with her. Kevin nodded.
I am.
Good. I hope it goes well. Gwen leaned forward and took Jen's hand. You know we'll be back, holidays and stuff, right? Jen nodded. I know, but it'll be weird to be on my own. Kevin nodded, taking another sip of his smoothie. Jen tossed her empty cup and stretched. I'm gonna head home. I could use some sleep. They nodded, and Gwen pulled her cousin into a hug. Love you, doofus. You too, dweeb. Jen laughed and hugged her back. She waved as she got into her car and drove off. Kevin took another sip of his smoothie.
That would have been a really good time to tell her about Max's partner idea.
Gwen shook her head, finishing her own smoothie. No, Grandpa's right. It'll be harder to fight the idea in front of the new partner. If he's smart about it, he'll brief them first. Let them at least read her file. Kevin frowned.
The fake one or the buried one?
Gwen frowned. She has 2 files? Kevin snorted.
Yeah, I buried one for Max a while back. Only a few people have access to it, and it's nigh impossible to hack unless you're a galvanic mechamorph.
Gwen frowned. Why does she have 2? Kevin shrugged.
There are ways to kill her that aren't public knowledge and don't need to be. The differences are small, but crucial.
Gwen nodded, the removal of the Ultimatrix, the fact that biologically she wasn't technically human anymore, her altered metabolism, her scars, her unique medical needs. Small but crucial differences indeed. She tossed her cup. Max frowned. He was off planet for the first time in a while. He had a few face-to-face interviews to do. So far, there were 3 candidates left for him to go through. Between him, Gwen, and Kevin, they had eliminated a long list of prospective partners. Some didn't have the drive needed, others lacked experience. He had it down to a Florana, a Tetramand, and a Ravana-Gander. That was a race he wasn't familiar with. This agent was the first of his people to join the Plumbers. It was interesting that he'd been put forward for consideration. Max had almost marked him off for lack of experience, but he'd been on a few missions during his time with the Academy. He'd helped head up the evacuation when Kevin had attacked the Academy, so he'd stayed on the list. He was also familiar with some of the new equipment they would be giving to Jen's new partner. But, of course, none of these beings knew that's what they were being interviewed for. As far as they knew, this was an easy checkup on them. Max sat down across from the Florana, who was twisting a vine nervously. Hello, Magister Tennyson, he burbled at him. Is there a problem? No one will really tell me what this is about. Their eye brightened. Wait, do I get to meet your granddaughter? Max inwardly shook his head. This one was too excitable. The last thing they needed was a star chaser watching Jen's back in the field. The Tetramand was a bit more acceptable, but too battle-hungry. That left only the Ravana-Gander before Max would have to start over in his search. The being waiting for him in the office was male, or at least according to his file. He was tall, at least 1.5 feet taller than Jen. He smiled as Max sat down in front of him. Hello, Agent Rook. The smile contained sharper canines than a human one, but that didn't bother Max. He went for drinks most weekends with a Pisces Vallon. He smiled back.
It is an honor to meet you, Magister Tennyson. I have read about your fight against Vilgax in several of my classes.
Max smiled. Not a mention of Jen, at least, not yet. The Tetramand had literally given him a comm number to give to her. The Florana kept bringing her up.
Thank you, Agent Rook. This is just a routine checkup of your progress outside the Academy. Tell me how things are going on Ravana. I hear it's not very eventful.
Rook nodded.
It is not very full of events, as you say. The most dangerous thing on Ravana are the muroids.
Max raised an eyebrow.
Very large rodents, usually 5 feet tall at their maturity. They can be a problem, but we have dealt with them since before Ravana first made contact with the universe.
Max nodded.
And that contact was only made over the last 20 or so years, right?
Rook nodded.
That is correct, Magister Tennyson. My people are highly traditional. Many believe that technology will change our way of life for the worse instead of for the better. But several of us, myself included,
believe that thinking like that will hold Ravana back. Max nodded.
Is that why you joined the plumbers?
Rook took a deep breath.
I joined the plumbers for many reasons. Yes, it was in part to help Ravana advance, but there was another reason.
He paused. Max nodded. Rook took another deep breath.
I was inspired by your granddaughter. I was 11 when she first defeated Vilgax. We heard about the tyrant from the plumbers stationed on Ravana. The thought that someone from a world not unlike my own, someone my age, being able to change so much on their own, it was inspiring. Still is. I believe the plumbers are the way I can help change the universe for the better.
Max nodded slightly.
How old are you, Rook?
The question seemed to take Rook by surprise.
I am 17 years old, sir, though I will be 18 in less than 8 months.
Max nodded. He set down his datapad.
Let me run a scenario by you. Tell me how you would react. Say you had a partner. They're acting strange, not like themselves, possibly threatening others. What would your first instinct be? What would you do?
Rook paused.
I would confront my partner, restrain them if need be, and if the situation escalated, I would call for backup.
Max nodded.
Another one for you. Your partner goes missing. They haven't been seen by anyone in days. Your direct supervisor orders you to give up the search. Give up your partner for dead. What would you do?
Rook paused, thinking.
This is a difficult question. Our job is a dangerous one. There is always the possibility that one will not make it home at the end of the day. But after just a few days?
Max nodded.
A few days. I do not believe that is enough time to give up anyone for dead, especially a trained plumber. I would continue the search. Is this a test of some kind?
Max smiled. Smart kid.
Maybe. Last scenario. You and a civilian are taken captive. Your captor says he will shoot one of you. It is up to you to decide who lives and who dies. Who do you choose? Yourself or the civilian?
Myself. He didn't even have to think. Max nodded and picked up his datapad again.
All right. It says here you're looking for a transfer off Ravana. Why? I believe I can do more good out in the universe than I can at home.
Max nodded again.
This is not a routine inspection of my progress outside of the academy, is it, Magister?
Max shook his head.
You're smart. That's good. And no, it's not a routine inspection. It's a job interview. Then why the subterfuge?
Max nodded.
Because this job is not only very sensitive, it's a highly sought-after position. Very few beings in the universe know the information you are about to receive, but a position on Earth is going to open up within a month. A partnership with a specialist based on Earth.
Rook's amber eyes widened.
Are you saying what I believe you are saying?
Max nodded.
My granddaughter needs a new partner. Her team is leaving by the end of the month. She'll need someone she can rely on. Someone who can watch her back. I think that you might be that someone.
Max said, handing over the datapad.
You can refuse, of course. This isn't an order, it's an opportunity. What do you say?
Rook blinked.
Why me, sir? There must be hundreds of beings more qualified to work alongside a specialist who has saved the universe more than once. Why pick me?
Max nodded.
That's a good question. You have experience with the tech we'll be supplying you if you accept the assignment. A proto-tool and proto-armor to help you keep up with her. She's not easy to keep up with. But you have drive. The right kind of drive. The same kind she has. So, what do you say?
Max reached out a hand.
I would be honored, sir.
He shook Max's hand.
Good. You have some studying to do. I recommend taking Conversational Earthling, maybe the Earth Society course too, just to get yourself acquainted with what you're getting into. It can be a bit of culture shock. You've got a month to prep, which should give you plenty of time to read her file.
Max pulled a second datapad out of his bag and handed it over to Rook. Rook looked down at the file on the screen. A smiling brunette looked back up at him. He really wasn't sure how he'd passed this test, but if it meant working alongside a living legend, he was not going to pass up the opportunity.